Good morning, everyone. I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Welcome to this week's History's Lunch program, which is sponsored by the John and Lucy Shackelford Charitable Fund of the Community Foundation for Mississippi. We're in our home, the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium in the Museum of Mississippi History and Mississippi Civil Rights Museum, and we're streaming live on both Facebook and YouTube, and those videos are available for you to watch anytime afterwards on both of those platforms. If you've not already silenced your cell phone, please do that now. This spring is the 60th anniversary of the game of change between Mississippi State University's men's basketball team and Loyola when the MSU squad snuck out of state for a matchup with the integrated Loyola team in defiance of state government. On Sunday at 2 o'clock, we have a fabulous program lined up that will feature several members of that Mississippi State basketball team. Los Angeles-based filmmaker Patrick Creedon will screen his new documentary that's told from the Loyola point of view. And then Starkville native Robbie Coblentz will screen his short documentary, One Night in March, that he made to commemorate the 50th anniversary of that game. So again, that's 2 o'clock this Sunday, free here in the auditorium, and I hope that you'll make it back for that. It is free. And then I hope you'll come back next week for History's Lunch when Mike O'Brien will talk about the Woolworths sit-in. O'Brien is the author of We Shall Not Be Moved, the Jackson Woolworths Sit-In and the Movement It Inspired, a fine book that was published by University Press of Mississippi in 2013. On the evening of February 21st of that year, O'Brien spoke at the Old Capitol Museum. Clay, do you remember? The weather, as they say, was frightful. About an hour before his talk was to begin, a biblical deluge rolled in and was accompanied by building rattling thunder and lightning flashes, and attendance was affected. And so we have been looking for a way to get Mike back, and I'm glad to have him scheduled for next week for History's Lunch. Today, we are delighted to welcome back our friends and former MDAH staff members Mike Bunn and Clay Williams to talk about their new book, Old Southwest to Old South, Mississippi, 1798 to 1840. The volume is the 9th in the Heritage of Mississippi series, which is published jointly by the Department of Archives and History, the Mississippi Historical Society, and the University Press of Mississippi, with funding assistance from the Phil Hardin Foundation. Those volumes are intended to stand as the definitive studies on the topics for years to come. Mike Bunn is director of Historic Blakely State Park in Spanish Fort, Alabama. He earned his BA at Faulkner University, an MA in History, and an MA in Higher Education Administration, both from the University of Alabama, and a graduate certificate in Public History from the University of West Georgia. Bunn's books include 14th Colony, The Forgotten Story of the Gulf South During America's Revolutionary Era. He did a fantastic History's Lunch on that during the pandemic. Early Alabama, An Illustrated Guide to the Formative Years, 1798 to 1826, and Alabama from Territory to Statehood, an Alabama Heritage Bicentennial Collection. Clay Williams is program manager of the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. He earned his BA in Political Science and MA in History and Public Policy Administration, both from Mississippi State University. From 1999 until his retirement in 2022, Williams worked for MDAH in a variety of roles that included Old Capitol Museum Director and Administrator of Museums and Historic Sites across the state. The pair have co-authored 2 books, Battle for the Southern Frontier, The Creek War and the War of 1812, and Old Southwest to Old South, Mississippi, 1798 to 1840. We'll hear from both Clay and Mike, one after another. First, help me welcome Clay Williams.
Okay, thank you all for having us here today. I know Mike and I have been here a few times, and it's always an honor and a pleasure to be here to speak to this History's Lunch. As the lights go down, no sleeping anybody. Again, we're honored to be here to talk about a subject that is very near and dear to us, a time period that has been kind of neglected over the years. And we'll talk about that and talk about how this whole book came about. As Chris mentioned, this is a volume of the Mississippi, the Heritage of Mississippi series. And Mike and I, first of all, we want to make sure we offer our thanks to Elbert Hilliard, the Director Emeritus of the department, and John Marslack, who made the poor decision of allowing Mike and I to write this book. So again, but we're very honored, and we thank y'all for y'all's help on that. Interesting enough, our volume wasn't going to be included in the Heritage of Mississippi series. They didn't have this time period in the initial set of books. And so Mike and I had to kind of lobby because, again, these 40 or so years have just been neglected. There's always been plenty of scholarship on Native Americans. There's been plenty of scholarship on colonialism. And then the next thing you know, the next volume and the next discussion seems to be, Mississippi's a state, and then the Confederacy opens fire on Fort Sumter. And it's just like, what happened to those 40, 50 years of how this thing came about? And there's such a formative part in Mississippi's history that Mike and I got into it and decided to really explore it. So how did this all come about? Well, Mike and I, as Chris mentioned, both used to work here at this department. We worked here a couple of years ago. And back in 2000, we were working in what at the time was the old Capitol Museum of Mississippi History, and we were redoing an exhibit known as the Territorial Room. It was a room that covered this time period that hadn't had much work on it since 1960 or so, and so we jumped into the research on developing, and neither one of us were very versed on these years of when Mississippi was a territory and some early statehood. And so we got into it and really delved into it, and Mike eventually moved on to greener pastures in his career, and we were the exhibit staff was about to put this exhibit in play when Hurricane Katrina came about, and changed everything here in Mississippi, and we never really got to do that exhibit, but Mike and I continued on the research, and it led to us doing numerous projects such as the Creek War book we mentioned earlier. Our goal in this thing is pretty simply to tell the state's founding era in a sweeping, subject-driven narrative that gives these crucial years the attention they so richly deserve. Again, just trying to bring these years out to the public's attention and talk about so many things happened in these 40 years that led us to where we are today, and they started at this time period. One of the issues with the book, and it came out during some of the reviews, is books are usually one of two ways. They're chronological, start at point A and move along to point B, or they're topical. Or we decided to really mess things up and do it both ways. And so sometimes as you're going through the book, it's going to feel very chronological as you move along, and sometimes it's very topical. We did not want to repeat any work in the other Heritage series books. There's one on Native Americans. We didn't want to dive in too much detail because there's a great volume written by Jim Barnett on Native Americans. There's a future volume coming out here soon on slavery in Mississippi. So we didn't want to get into too much detail on that because there's going to be a set-alone volume on that. Finally, there's lots of Alabama in the book. Someone may mention, well, why am I reading about Mobile? Why am I reading about Huntsville? Well, what does that have to do with Mississippi? Well, it just goes to show you the point that at one time, Alabama and Mississippi were one territory. By 1812, the future states of Mississippi and Alabama were one. And so the connections between those two states have always been very strong, and that's why you're going to read a lot of Alabama in the book. Before we go too much further, Mike, and I do want to point out those who kind of came before us. The book on the left, or maybe y'all's right, I can't remember, is Frontiers and Conflict by Thomas Clark and John Geiss. One of our favorite books of all time. Obviously, being a history guy, I've read many history books. This is one of the few I've read numerous times. The writing, the narrative, the stories they tell on this developmental period is great. So I would obviously we recommend our book, of course, but we also recommend this one as a classic. And the other book, Robert Haynes wrote The Mississippi Territory and the Southwest Frontier. Robert Haynes has been researching this time period for over 50 years. For those who are familiar with Richard McLemore's 2-volume set of Mississippi history that came out in the 70s, he wrote the chapters on the book that we're talking about. So Mike and I in our life will never know as much as what Robert Haynes knows. Unfortunately, all these gentlemen have passed away now, so unfortunately you're stuck with Mike and I now in regards to the experts on this territorial period. But it is so crucial, and we're going to talk a little bit as we move along on how Mississippi kind of went from this region of the country that became the old Southwest, because in 1800, this was the southwestern portion of the country. There wasn't an Oklahoma and Texas, to what became known as the Old South. So Mike and I's plans are for the next couple of minutes is to kind of give you an overview of and some tidbits and some little teasings of what the book's going to be about and what kind of information you'll be able to come into contact with. So starting off is kind of the starting point, and that is an important treaty in this country's history, and that's the Treaty of San Lorenzo, treaty between the United States and Spain that was signed in October of 1795. And this finally settled a long-term dispute on where the border would be between the new United States and what became known as Spanish Florida. they finally established the 31st parallel as that boundary between that. And what makes that important is that brings the famous Natchez District finally under U.S. control. And as a part of that story and a part of that treaty and requirements required for that boundary to be identified. And Andrew Ellicott was the gentleman who came down here with mainly two main roles in this whole process. One, to actually mark the boundary with Spanish officials, but he was also coming down here to kind of accept possession of this territory. The treaty is signed in October of 1795. Ellicott, due to a variety of reasons, doesn't get down to the Natchez area until 1797, February, so almost 2 full years. And he's amazed by what he finds on his journey. There's a journal that you can read in this collection, in this building here, of his journey down here and everything he took part of. But he found out the Spanish officials were nowhere near withdrawing from the area. Many of the upper heads of the Spanish government had kind of thought maybe this treaty was signed too hastily and were kind of trying to delay the project. Well, Ellicott did not have the patience for that. The time he got to Natchez, he was pretty irate. And so he decided to kind of make a strong statement. And he raised the U.S. flag on a place we now know as the house on Ellicott Hill. And as he wrote in his journal, that flag wore out upon the staff. The Spanish leadership did not want him to raise this flag, thought it would cause too much controversy, but he said, I don't care, we're raising it. It's time, this is now U.S. property. And so it's kind of one of those momentous, iconic moments in U.S. history. We have a dangling M there. We apologize for that. I've heard of dangling participles. Now we have a dangling M. Factionalism is a huge issue during this time period. I know nowadays we're not used to government fighting, but it was a big deal back in this time period. Now, they didn't have Twitter and social media and 24-hour news networks, but they had newspapers. The gentleman on your left is Marshall. He's mainly known in Mississippi history as the man who printed the first laws of the territory. He was also a newspaper guy. And he liked to point his gun, so to speak, at the gentleman on the right, Mr. Poindexter, one of the most famous early statesmen in Mississippi history. But I'm sure Mike and I joke, when we walked outside today and walked down Capitol Street and told people to tell me about George Poindexter, 0% would be able to tell me exactly who he was. He wrote our first state constitution. He was our first state representative, and so forth. Where Marshall and Poindexter did not get along, and that was not getting along is almost a theme in our early part of the book. Marshall accused Poindexter of firing early in a duel in 1811, which according to the rules of honor, that was a big no-no. And more importantly, he accused Poindexter of cowardice at the Battle of New Orleans. Poindexter liked to talk about his bravery down at the Battle of New Orleans, down with Andrew Jackson in the War of 1812. And Marshall called him a coward, which was the end-all, be-all. So Poindexter finally had enough, and in a great act of civility, decided to chase Andrew Marshall through the towns of Washington, Mississippi with a brick. So we have a lot of crazy fighting in Congress and whatnot today, but I don't know if we've had anybody chase anybody with a brick lately. Actually got both men put in jail for a little bit of time so they could cool off. So this is just one example of this massive infighting that happens between the government officials, parties, everything. It was just, nobody was happy. It was mainly about power. There was a big shock. Who would have thought people would be fighting about power? There's a great quote here by an early historian named William B. Hamilton. He was at Duke, and he summed it up ways better than I ever could, that the desire for office and power, petty geographical jealousies, sectionalism, the colonial relationship with the U.S., and personal and family relationships were the driving forces, and as he put it, that were, so to speak, what the shouting was all about. So one of the common themes you're going to hear about during this time period is fighting. So what we have today in the political realm is nothing new. In fact, it might have been more vicious here. The only reason it's more vicious nowadays is because, as you know, we have it 24/7. One of the biggest issues of the time when Mississippi becomes a territory is land ownership. One of the territorial officials had to figure out who owned what land. For years, you had countries like England giving out land grants, Spain giving out land grants. The state of Georgia at one time claimed this land all the way to the Mississippi River. There were squatters who had just moved onto this land and sat. And so that was the number one issue, is determining who owns what, because how can you even dole out other land if you don't know who owns the land that's there? Eventually, some legislations passed, known as the Land Act of 1803, that kind of begins solving this issue. But land issues and ownership was such a major issue at this time period. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Mike.
Hello, everybody. Appreciate y'all having us here and to share this story with you. And I'm going to pick it up where Clay leaves off. I just want to reinforce a lot of things that he was talking about, and a lot of the ways I'm going to deal with the things that were coming up is that we are hitting some of the major events that help shape the period that we dive into in more detail in the book. And some of these issues are political and local issues, and some are military issues. The Creek War and the War of 1812 we deal with in the book, and we've written a book about this, so we could easily get sidetracked on it. But this conflict is sort of a watershed conflict that plays into the development of the region as a whole. In order to understand what happened in the Mississippi Territory and when statehood occurred for Alabama and Mississippi in the way it did and where it did, all that, you've got to understand a little bit about this war, which was fought entirely within the territory. And I'm not going to give you a whole blow-by-blow on it right here. We go through a quick overview of it in the book, but we talk about it as a turning point and a cataclysmic event that altered the trajectory of the South and certainly in the Mississippi Territory. And we talk a lot about some of the more pivotal battles, such as Fort Mims, where in a nutshell, you had settlers and some militia and Creeks who had not sided with the Red Sticks, who were basically seeking shelter in temporary places of refuge built around settlers' homes. There are lots of these in what is now southwestern Alabama in 1813, and because there was a Creek Civil War that was brewing. They're fighting each other, and there was a great fear that all this would ultimately spread to involve American settlements, and it did. And long story short, the Americans fired the first shots, technically. But in reprisal of what they did, they came back and attacked Fort Mims, which is one of the more significant days in this region's history. They laid waste to the fort. It was a stunning victory, killed hundreds in there, and it really initiated the awareness of what was happening in this region, and it caused there to be armies raised in neighboring states, including Andrew Jackson's armies raised in Georgia, within the Mississippi Territory, and elsewhere that would descend on this region. And it's mostly in the eastern section of the territory, Alabama, but they're descending on these Creek strongholds, and that's where the war is going to be waged. And we give a quick overview of it. We talk about some of the key leaders, including William Weatherford, Red Eagle, who made a famous leap into the Alabama River as a village there that he was at was being destroyed by an American army. We talk about fighting at battles that a lot of people haven't heard about, like Calibi Creek and Atossi, over in eastern Alabama in what is now Macon County, Alabama. But we just talk about all these campaigns that were meant to coordinate, and you end up basically having 3 distinct campaigns that did not coordinate. And the final campaign that most of us who know anything about the Creek War know about is the final campaign that ended at Horseshoe Bend, in which Andrew Jackson's army defeated the largest single army the Red Sticks had raised, and it resulted in the largest loss of life by Native Americans in any battle against the United States in American history. We often tell people a lot of that. If you don't know the history of this region, a lot of people think, well, was it that out west somewhere? But it was right here in the Mississippi Territory. So we go through all that and we explain all that, what happened, as a way to help people understand what happened next. But there's another little sidetrack on this to understand the bigger picture of the Creek War, is that it was a part of the War of 1812. While this nation was at war with Great Britain, a lot of these things were happening as a backdrop, and there's a connection that the British, when they were fighting, that they had assumed that some of these disgruntled Creeks and other groups that were a little bit concerned about the issue of American expansion onto their territory, they assumed they might be a logical ally should they turn their attention to the Gulf Coast, and they had eyes on capturing New Orleans. To make a very complicated story short, by the time they turned their attention here, Horseshoe Bend had happened. There was no large Red Stick army ready to assist them, but they proceeded on their plan to capture New Orleans very late in the war. And there's actually 2 battles fought in the Mississippi Territory before the Battle of New Orleans over the British trying to get to New Orleans. Both are fought at Mobile Point, which is where modern-day Fort Morgan is, and we discussed that in the book. The British were actually defeated in their first effort to get to New Orleans. Andrew Jackson at that point realized he had moved his headquarters to Mobile after the defeat of Red Sticks at Horseshoe Bend, realized how and where and in what capacity the British were going to make their way to New Orleans, and so he takes the opportunity to go over to Pensacola without official orders to stop them from using the Spanish post of Pensacola, which they were using as a base of operations for these things. So he goes over, we talk about that capture of Pensacola. He swings back over to Mobile, and he gets over to New Orleans just a few minutes, almost literally, before the British. He tries to stop them at night as they're landing, and we know what happened next. There's some skirmishing. They end up fighting this pivotal clash known as the Battle of New Orleans, January 8th, 1815, which brings that war to a close. And all this is happening within the context of a territory that had grown very slowly and was suddenly the pivotal location in a pretty pitched series of battles in a war that's going to change regional history. And what we do after talking about the war itself is we try to help explain in the next chapter what the outcome of all this really was. And that was that it set the stage for a massive migration in the territory unlike anything it had seen previous, and really ended up defining a lot of the time period. And we've got some great quotes from some gentlemen who worked on this, like Charles Lowry, who's published a lot about it. By horse, by wagon, by boat, and by foot, a flood of humanity poured in. So that sort of sets the stage for the development of the area. And a few quick stats. In 1800, just 2 years after the Mississippi Territory was created, that entire area, the entire landmass that would eventually become Mississippi and Alabama, except for the coastal region, of course, had not been added. But that entire area had an American population of only 5,000 people. Now, there were certainly Native American populations, but just the American population that had settled there. By 1810, that entire area had grown a pretty good bit to 40,000. But after the Creek War, between the Creek War ending, 1813, by 1819, when Alabama entered the Union, Mississippi became a state in 1817. Alabama enters the Union in 1819. At that point in time, Mississippi had a population of 75,000 and Alabama nearly 144,000. Dramatic increase. And what happened is that the Creeks were forced to cede millions and millions of acres. And that set the stage for this settlement. And that's a big focus on what we talk about in the book. Some more great stats. One traveler in the course of just a few days traveling from the Mississippi Territory going towards Georgia on this little wilderness path that played such a pivotal role in this time period. We don't have time to get into all the history of the Federal Road, but it's not a super wide highway, and up until the Creek War, it was not exceptionally well traveled. You may have seen some isolated post riders and a few settlers, but he just saw a flood of humanity. Look at the stats, what he saw in just a few days. He ended up seeing over 3,000 people in an area that, remember, just a decade before had a total population of 5,000 people. So this is a pretty significant increase in population. And it's where we get the term, if you've ever read anything about the time period, you've heard of what's called Alabama fever. It's sort of a tongue-in-cheek nod to the fact that so many people were looking to come settle in this area. And they took the name from the Alabama River, and they said anybody who gets a glimpse of it catches a fever, and it's contagious because they go tell their friends about it, and everybody wants to move down there. And we talk about, there's a lot of Alabama in the book, but this Alabama fever, this term, this notion applied for the whole territory. They are literally saying Alabama. This is before Alabama was even a state. It was just referred to the region. So we talk a lot about the experience, what it was like to all these people coming in, how they're changing the area, what it was like as they first encountered it. We've got a great quote from one of the early settlers who, I won't read the whole quote, but he's basically saying, here's what my father told me to look for when I moved here. And it's pretty specific. If you'll read that, he's saying, I'm looking for this specific point of land. So they are coming, and they're not settling haphazardly. They are looking for specific things, and those specific things end up being the formation of some of the first communities that we recognize as being formed in the time period. And it was a big change to pick up your whole family and move to this territory that you had never seen, but you had heard about, you had read about. And we try a lot of what we try to do in the book, to be candid, is to help the experiences of the people who lived through this kind of come to life. Help you understand what it was like to actually live there to the best we can. And we know one of the major migrations that's occurring to that in that time period is not just the settlers coming to operate farms and plantations, but they're bringing thousands, hundreds of thousands of slaves. So what's it like for these people who are being forced here against their will? What's it like to live in this new territory and to see that population increase, which is changing everything about the territory? And remember, this whole book is filling that gap between the colonial period and the height of the antebellum period, and we felt it was important to try to understand how it got those two eras, how they fit together. And that's a crucial part of it. We've got another quote from Gideon Lincecum that described the process of what it was like to move to a settlement that was literally a patch of woods and to turn it into a home. To go about the process of planting your first crop, building your first home, all that, the physical labor it took, the process it was like, we go through that with some great accounts that we have. And the next big issue that's on the table, once the settlers, we talk about the pace of migration, is there's a pace and a development and a concern about where and when and how is this state ultimately going to enter the Union, where its capital is going to be, et cetera. And I'm going to let Clay walk you through a few of those arguments.
Okay, so as we said, we formed a state, we've become the 20th state in the Union, and we've got to set up some governmental processes. Who can tell me what this building is we're looking at? Yes, it's Assembly Hall. Used to be located in Washington. Unfortunately, it burned in 1993, but it was one of the buildings that the Mississippi legislature would use for their government. Who can tell me what that is? Tejada, that's in Natchez, another government building, it's not a government building, a private home that was used for the Mississippi legislature and assembly. And I guess the point in showing these pictures is it was a while until the Mississippi government actually had their own state-owned building to run their government. And it took a while for Jackson to become the capital. As many of y'all know, the capital of this state and territory has been in several places. It was in Natchez, it was in Washington, it was even in Columbia, Mississippi for a short bit of time. A huge turning point in Mississippi history that many scholars like to talk about is the Treaty of Doak-Stan. That was signed in 1820, one of the big first major cession treaties by the Choctaw Nation in the center of the state. And when that treaty happened and it opened up that portion of the state for settlement, that allowed the idea of moving the government, the seat of power, away from the river counties. For many years, it was those along the river in the Natchez area who dominated the political system. And there's always been an idea, if we've got to do something to limit their power. They tried it early on by moving way up the road to Washington, 6 miles up the road. That wasn't that far of a run, so they decided to move it to the center of the state. So after moving to Columbia in February of 1821, a move they knew was going to be temporary, they set up a commission to basically locate a site in the land recently ceded by the U.S. by the Choctaws. And a 3-man commission, Thomas Hines, William Lattimore, and James Patton, were selected. Patton never served. A guy by the name of Peter Van Dorn served. That Van Dorn name probably means a lot to many people. His son was Earl Van Dorn, who was a general in the Civil War. They found a place right up the road here, known as LaFleur's Bluff, that met the requirements that they thought for a new capital. Good air, good land, a water source, et cetera, et cetera. And then what I think is the greatest quote of all time about when they chose that decision or chose that location, it would be in the vicinity of which no settlement had yet been formed, so none could complain of a partial choice. Basically, it was in the middle of nowhere, so nobody could say, well, why did you choose that? So Jackson becomes the capital. This is what is known as the Van Dorn map, and the public can barely see it. It's in our collection. It was kind of the typical Jeffersonian grid layout of a city. If you see in the very center, I'm going to try to do this so people online won't see this, but this is the Capitol Green. They knew at one point at the intersection of Capitol and State would be where a new Capitol building would be built. So that's kind of showing you how they wanted the city of Jackson to develop. The actual first Capitol here in Jackson was a 2-story brick building. The first time the state of Mississippi owned their own government building. It was built at the corner, I believe, of President and Capitol Street, I believe. They actually met there for the first time on Christmas Eve of 1822. kind of a strange time to meet. But they knew quickly that that building was not going to be big enough or large enough to house a growing government. Mike will talk about what happened after that. But Jackson did grow slowly. There were several attempts to move the capital out of Jackson. Clinton, Vicksburg, places like that. It wasn't until the 1830 Constitution that finally established that Jackson would be capital at least until 1850. And by that time, they'd built the great new state house. The city had grown enough, and so Jackson's time as capital was kind of secured. Obviously, a huge issue in this time period, Mike and I are again talking about various themes and issues, is Native American removal. One of the dark sides of our state's and our country's history. Jim Barnett covers it in super detail in Mississippi Indians book, his Heritage series. Summarizing briefly, white Mississippians are simply not going to recognize Indian rights to land. The soil is too good. Mike will talk about this more. Eventually, we develop a cotton gin. We learn about growing cotton. There's so much land available. Basically, white Mississippians are not going to allow Native Americans to stay here. And for 30 years, as you can see from this map, they kind of cordon off and sign various treaties that's going to remove the Native Americans, unfortunately, westward. Image here, this came from the University of Michigan. It's kind of to me, a very interesting image of Andrew Jackson as kind of the great father figure holding some Native Americans in his arms. No other figure in Mississippi history is as important to removal than Andrew Jackson himself. His activities in the Creek War, that initial treaty that Mike mentioned that ended the Creek War, was one of the first cession treaties in this country at this time, in this part of the country. And so two main events that occur that really kind of leads Mississippi down a path of removal, and that's what's going to happen. One is Jackson's elected president, and in March of 1829, his opening speech, he basically makes Indian removal his #1 priority. And as soon as he does that, the Mississippi legislature basically passes a law that following January that says we will no longer recognize Indian sovereignty. Basically, just not going to recognize the tribes themselves. So the Choctaws and the Chickasaws are going to get forced out. And that leads to, unfortunately, a very depressing Trail of Tears. Most people associate Trail of Tears with the Cherokee coming from Georgia. But the Choctaws and the Chickasaws had their own miserable time moving over. Inefficiency, corruption, just poor government action, you name it, made the journey horrible. Errol Gibson is an early historian as well, who kind of summarized that those who had to journey had to overcome the trauma of leaving the land of their ancestors, hundreds of years, and be forced out of that and then try to build a new life in what we know today as Oklahoma. The image on the bottom there is a little clip of a baldric in this museum's collection. It was a Chickasaw baldric that was given to someone on the eve of removal. I think one of the neatest artifacts they have in this museum's collection. And then summing up, Clark and Geis again, who I just, they're our heroes in a way a little bit. They had a great quote in their book that kind of summarized this transition that gets us out of this at one point, this frontier, and that's a word that's got a lot of meaning in itself, was dominated by the ancient nations. But eventually that they're going to be eclipsed by a new power, which has sometimes been referred to as the peculiar institution of slavery, which is really going to eventually dominate the frontier of the old Southwest. So Mike's going to take it over and talk about some of those issues.
That image on the screen means a lot in Southern history, and especially in Mississippi, and there's a whole lot that we explain with the process of slavery, the institution, the way it was administered, what it was like for those enslaved, and how it influenced every other part of Mississippi. This is not just a slavery story. This is a story of settlement, land, economies, entire crops. Entire economies were mortgage-owned cotton crops. So as Clay mentioned, there are other volumes in the Heritage series that delve specifically with all the inner workings of the institution of slavery. It's vital to our story, but we didn't want to try to rewrite that. What we wanted to do is find a way to understand the experience of the people who lived here and fit that into the time period. And what we do in the book is we go from everything from the understanding that cotton can be profitable, to explaining the importance of the cotton gin, to how certain cotton strains, including one which eventually led to becoming known as Pettit Gulf cotton, that was originally, according to legend, brought into Mississippi in seeds stuffed into dolls taken out of Mexico. So we explain the desire to find the best sort of seed and how it can be best grown and most profitably traded is a vital part of understanding this whole era of Mississippi's development. And as Clay has also mentioned, we talk about that the goal to have that land and that labor source, those two things work together with removal. So all of this kind of fits together in why this is being done. And in the book, and I'm going to just flash through a few images, we really literally try to take you through the process in brief fashion of what it's like to actually go through clearing the land, planting the crop, maintaining it, doing all the things you have to do while it's growing, the process, what's going on throughout the year, what it was like to live in those circumstances, to do that sort of work, and of course, ultimately to harvest it and what that meant to Mississippi's economy, the process of ginning it, compressing the bales for shipment on steamboats, on railroads. This is something that involved just about every aspect of Mississippi in some way. And it's just a great lens through which to understand the connection, the agricultural economy, and what that meant for those who are living here, and the experience of slavery. A lot of that is wrapped up in that story, and we try to do that in the book. And just try to utilize that overarching story, which is not the only story. And we talk about that a little bit in the book, about the other things that were going on. But that is one that plays into so much of this early period of development that really reached its peak in what we know as the Old South. Again, this is a book about the transition between this colonial period, where this was literally the southwestern frontier of America, and by just a few decades, it had become so enmeshed in what we know as the Old South and the Cotton Kingdom. So we're trying to help people understand how that played out and what it was like to live through it. And in the course of doing that, we also want to explain a little bit about what cultural and educational life and every other aspect of life was like for people living here. And there's a wonderful quote that I've used in many presentations from Ephraim Kirby, who was a judge in the Tom Bigby district in the Mississippi Territory. And I wonder if it might be switched out with current descriptions sometimes, but you can read it. He said, "The present inhabitants, with few exceptions, are illiterate, wild, and savage, and depraved morals, unworthy of public confidence or private esteem, litigious, disunited," and this is the best part, "and knowing each other, universally distrustful of each other." So this is an exaggeration of one group of people, but we're trying to paint the portrait that the people who lived here and wrote about the place painted as this is not the most orderly, precise settlement. This is really sort of a rowdy, Wild West sort of settlement that's happening here, and we try to help people understand that. And we do talk about some of the leading lights, such as William Dunbar and some of the other scholarly people who were here, some of the writers, etc. But it's sort of a rough and tumble society. And some of the things that we associate with Mississippi today, organized religion, churches, all this, they really got their start in this time period. If you had gone through early territorial period Mississippi, you would have found very few churches. One point in time in the Mississippi Territory, one scholar has estimated maybe only 5% of the entire population belonged to an organized church. Church was camp meetings and places like this where a lot of those congregations that eventually are developed in the 18-teens, 1820s got started. So we go through that process and we explain the major denominations that took root during the time period. We talk about some of the architecture and some of the communities that sprang up around these places. And we talk about also a lot about daily life in the book, which is something I'm proud that we're able to do to help people understand, again, what it's like to live there and unfortunately to die there, because there are a lot of threats to life that we today know how to avoid that were just part and parcel of life. Things that are diseases that are spread by mosquitoes, like yellow fever. Epidemics of yellow fever could break out and could kill an entire half a city's population in a matter of months, and people have no idea exactly how to contain it, how to stop it. And you live in this environment, and this threat of this environment as just a part of daily life. And that's a little bit different than the way that we understand a lot today. And some of these things seem so simple to us because of our advanced medical knowledge. John Quitman had a quote just after an epidemic in Natchez, just one of those personal accounts, who talked about the fact that he walked back into town. He said whole families there have been exterminated. Painful to see the desolation on the streets. A gloom and a sadness pervaded the whole place. But this is a town he was going back to continue business there, continue living there. And it was not a place that they were going to leave and never come back to. And we talk about the personal experiences of people dealing with this this sort of haphazard medical profession of the day. Gideon Lincecum had another humorous quote that he had a medical issue, and he said, I went to see several doctors. Every one of them had a different solution, but the one thing they all agreed on is he needed to be bled. You know, they needed to get some blood out of him was the one thing they all agreed on, which is, you know, obviously we look at that today and know that wasn't necessarily the best method, but this is sort of the state of medical knowledge. And what were people doing for fun there? We talk about that a little bit in the book. Gambling was immensely popular. Just about everybody who came and traveled to Mississippi, and we rely on a lot of travelers' accounts to help flesh out some of these details, they talked about how prominent gambling was. And when you combine it, even with the Choctaws, you know, at the ball plays, there were wagers being placed. And when you combine it with strong drink, with alcohol, which was prevalent and easy to find, and you get gambling, and you're living in the society where there are duels and things, there's a lot of altercations that take place, and these things draw the attention of people who are visiting. And they talk about the infamous reputations of some portions of the state that are involved in this sort of stuff. And certainly we don't try to say that's happening everywhere, but it's notable that this is one of the factors of early society that people are talking about. We try to help people understand that in the book. We also try to help them understand a little bit of the physical growth of the infrastructure, the major communities which took root in this time period. This is an early map of Mobile during the period right before the territory is broken up. And obviously Mobile looks a little bit different than that today. So a lot of these communities got started as just sort of a small grid of streets and really started from very little. There was only one community that would have ranked as what they would have called a true city in the territory and early statehood period. That would have been Natchez, and this image is on the cover of our book. This is Natchez, and there is, about 1822, there is nothing else anywhere in Mississippi and Alabama that looked remotely like this at that time. This would have been the true metropolis of this entire area. So we spent a little time talking about the development of early cities and what that was like. And I've got a quote from our own book here, but it was not a nice, polished place. We sum up a little bit about this as if you go to one of these early cities, the acrid smell of smoke from dozens of kitchens and hearths hung heavy in the air. They're using the wood for heating and for cooking, along with other pungent odors such as an assemblage of men and beasts might generate in a hot and humid environment with no running waters, no sewer, and no air conditioning. So we really try to put you in the time and place and help you understand a little bit of what it was really like at the time. And we talk about the major communities. Natchez, we spent a lot of time on Natchez in the book. It was that one major population center, political center, economic center, meant a lot to the early state. And we talk about its counterpart, Natchez under the Hill, which I know a lot of you are familiar with. We talk about the observers what they saw there was going on in this sort of rowdy part of town. We talk about the development of the road system. Places like this, old sunken piece of the Natchez Trace. We talk about some of the early roads that were constructed and developed during that time period and how people move from place to place. We talk about the fact that water travel is the primary means of travel at this time, and it's not just all steamboats. There's a variety of other sort of watercraft of every shape and description that people are using to trade and to travel on Mississippi's rivers, and especially on the Mississippi itself. And we talk about the fact that the steamboat was developed in this time period and what it was like to first see these things when this is the age of sail. You had never seen a mechanical invention afloat like this, and what a spectacle that would have been. And then we talk about how it radically transformed the trade and transportation network within the state that made a lot of what we talk about with agricultural developments possible. And so we just try to cover all of the range of how the state sort of began to develop the way it did and set the stage for what came after. And then our last chapter in the book deals with the political aspects, the political life of the state, and how the political interest sort of changed from having this focus on intensely local things with candidates that was mainly about personality, local issues, and gradually as the state developed and people moved in, it became more and more to be involved part and parcel with national politics, national parties. So you go from the age of Poindexter, who was a vital part of a lot of early things that were happening in early parts of the state's history, integral in a lot of the state's early developments. But he's operating in an era in which, for all intents and purposes, you don't really have an active political party system working in Mississippi. It's a little bit later in the development of this period that you get to have people of national reputation that political parties sort of form around. And Andrew Jackson, who was viewed by a lot of Mississippians who were voters at the time, they viewed him as one of their own from his involvement in the state for so many years, going back to the days of his first marriage, all the way through the Creek War, what he'd done in the War of 1812. And he became, as we well know, the most visible symbol for a lot of things with westward expansion, American expansion, Native American removal, etc. And to understand the political dynamics of the time period, we felt you had to understand Jackson's influence in America at the time and how Mississippi was involved now with this larger political discussion. And as I mentioned, all the things with Western expansion that he represented and his popularity that launched him to 2 terms as president, we deal with in the book as a way of understanding what was political life like at the time, what were the currents that drove him to power, and how did that leave an imprint on the state. And for a lot of, there's a lot of sad episodes in that. There's some things to be proud of in Mississippi's early development. There's a lot of unfortunate things. We just wanted to bring it all out to help people understand how it developed the way it did and why. And we closed the book with one of Andrew Jackson's final public appearances, very late in life. He makes a trip back to his namesake city, and he's too ill to even speak there. But we follow him as he goes up the river and is welcomed at Vicksburg, and he takes a railroad, which in his first days in Mississippi, he could not have conceived of a railroad engine. He takes a steamboat, and he passes by all this development, and the state had radically changed from his earliest days, and we kind of view it from his vantage point, and he ends up right outside of where we are today at the old Capitol, which was just a monumental edifice that would have been one of the most grand public buildings anywhere in the South at the time. And you have to understand how, at the beginning of that time period, to see something like this on that hill, to have been constructed to represent what the state was and what they hoped it would become, would have been just an incredible change that occurred within one lifetime. And that's one of the biggest points that we make in the book, is that over the course of just one lifetime, 4 decades, Mississippi had made this incredible transition from a backwoods, remote colonial frontier. It had become one of the most prosperous states in the nation. Not everybody sharing in that prosperity equally, but there is money being made here, and it's becoming a vital part of the American economy and America's political infrastructure. And that's all happened not within the course of 100, 200 years. This happened within just a few decades, and it sets the stage for what's going to happen in the next chapter of Mississippi's story that I would offer is probably a little bit better understood than this formative era that bridges this colonial and this antebellum period. So that's a little overview of the book and what we've done in it. We certainly get into the weeds of too many of the details of all the stories that we tell, but we wanted today to give you a little overview of the way we approached it and what sort of stories we hope to tell, and ultimately why we think this is such a vital part of understanding Mississippi's overall trajectory over the course of the centuries here. I think we have some time for questions.
If anyone has a question, you can raise your hand, and we will. Question right here. We'll get you next, Vince.
So this is a little knowledge can be a dangerous thing question. Some of what I've read about this period on the Yazoo land deals, which you alluded to, and the Choctuma Land Company, that the land speculation, which didn't originate in Mississippi, was kind of responsible for Mississippi having the best land be in large tracts rather than small. And so I wondered if you'd comment on that.
Well,
trying to think of how
I can't say from what I know from both Alabama and Mississippi history that the land speculation itself is the reason, but the speculators, regardless of where and when, are speculating on the biggest, best tracts. They're well financed. They know where the best land is, and they're sending the surveyors to find them, and that certainly happened when Alabama was laying out its public lands, they had a surveyor named Thomas Freeman who happened to have already been to all these places. And so the best tracks he identified and they had advanced knowledge of. So I think that certainly went on, and it's probably the part of the story all together there. I don't think that one resulted in the other. I think that it was happening at the same time. The people who were financing this had some advanced knowledge of where some of the best lands were. So if that helps answer the question.
Yeah, you're alluding to the Yazoo land frauds when the state of Georgia and whatnot. We're talking about a complicated issue. Various companies were granted thousands of acres over here, and they did it behind closed doors. They eventually, the Georgia legislature had to go back and undo that, but people had already been given land. That's why the land issue was such a nightmare over here, was due to that and massive speculation, as you mentioned. I mean, land. I mean, we could talk for a day here and write a book, and there have been books written on land speculation and the nightmare of what it was, and greed, and you name it. It was a mess.
Just something very quick. The illustrations you showed when you were discussing the creation of cotton fields, some of the very colorful ones of African Americans working in the fields, were those old WPA?
Some of them are much later than the time period we're talking about. I did have a few images like from Harper's Weekly and things like that. But it was just to illustrate the point of this processes were the same. And we try to walk you through what those processes are.
I don't have the microphone. Thank you. First thing is, I didn't understand one thing about the old Capitol, and I know that you used to be responsible for that. What exact year you were talking about did Mississippi actually declare Jackson the capital with that 1830 Constitution? Kind of explain that little part a little bit better. And then the other question I have, through a little bit of historical research of my own, or basically I just read a little part of it, but can you explain anything that you know about the Revolutionary War veterans that were given land grants on the river? And then anything that you could describe about the legend of the doll would be appreciative too.
Legend
Thank
of
you.
the what?
The doll, the cottonseed doll.
Oh,
like
okay.
I know something. I don't know if that was like a diplomat or who that person was. I don't know that part of the story.
Well, let me jump into a couple of those things. Back to the land issue. During the Revolutionary War, England, in lieu of paying their soldiers, would give land grants to soldiers in this part of the country. And some of those soldiers, a few, would actually take up those land grants and move here. Many of them never came here. And one of the bits of legislation I mentioned was the Land Act of 1803, and it basically established that if someone was here and had cultivated the land and improved the land, they could have ownership to it. But in regard, if you got a land grant but never actually came here and took it up, you couldn't show up years later and say, "Hey, look, I got this from England in 1779," and so forth. So I don't know if that answers a little bit of your question. Jackson becoming the capital, 1822, 1821, I believe is the date of that, because I know the legislature made it in December of 22, and I don't know if it was late 21 or 22 when the legislature officially made Jackson the capital. And it was, of course, it's been capital ever since, but it wasn't until that 1832 Constitution that they said that Jackson would be capital all the way up through 1850. And the seed thing, I'm going to let you handle that.
If I can remember correctly, now this few years ago when we were researching this, it was a gentleman named Walter Burling, 1806, went to Mexico, was in some way, shape, or form associated with this alleged conspiracy of Aaron Burr and this separatist movement. We don't know all the details. We do know he visited with some high-ranking Mexican officials and was rebuffed in his sort of offer to say, we'll not include you if you'll pay us. And I'm summarizing that. But he left, he found this cottonseed and asked how he could get it back to America. And they weren't supposed to allow him to take it, to sell the seed. And so they arranged this little ingenious method of he could take, they said, we can't sell you the seed, but we can sell you all the Mexican dolls that you want on the street. Hint, hint, we'll put the seeds inside the dolls. And so he came back with that, and there's a lot that happened between there and Rush Nut, working on strains of cotton in the Natchez district, but the two are connected, and I not remember every detail of that, but that's the gist of the story.
We have a question from the live stream. What was the average migrant to Mississippi's understanding of a relationship to the federal government, and how were local governments organized?
Their understanding of the relationship with the federal government was that they usually had very little connection to the government except for that land that they were going to help them acquire. Usually had very little direct contact with federal government. I would
I mean,
say.
one of the issues when the territories first established is there were a lot of people in this area who were fleeing the federal government. They didn't want anything to do with the they had gone as far away as they could, and so when the U.S. claimed control, not everybody was jumping for joy on that new sovereignty that was going to be had. They were completely happy under the Spanish, who were letting them kind of live as they lived. So, I don't know if that answers. What was the second question? I mean,
Ad hoc.
yeah, differently.
A whole lot. If you read the territorial, anything on the territorial legislature's minutes, like the park I work at now, Historic Blakely State Park, it was the site of a town that was chartered by the Mississippi Territorial Legislature in 1814. There was no town there when that was chartered, but it was the charter to say now you have permission to go sell lots and do a town. So a lot of this happened with people chartering, buying the land, and then getting permission to sell lots. And as people moved in, they would develop sort of a temporary government, like they did when Elcott's in Natchez. And basically it's a appointed council that says, we're going to keep law and order with this committee. And then as they matured and got more people, they'd organize regular elections. So it's sort of an organic growth from sort of a chaotic beginning to a more formal government as the settlement grows.
One of the graphics we probably should have put in this presentation was, and we used to sell those maps with the Mississippi Historical Society. One was like a map of Mississippi 1820, and you show some of the counties that had been developed along the Mississippi River and Natchez. And then the last slide that Mike had was from 1840 that shows the whole state divvied up into counties and whatnot. So again, as Mike has made a point, sometimes it's not even 4 decades. Sometimes it's 2 decades where Mississippi went from no organization to almost looking like the state looks like today.
Those maps are still sold today.
Thank you.
There you go. Thank you for that
So
correction.
do I get a percentage of those sold now after advertising?
Thank you for the presentation. I'm curious to hear, I know occasionally the Creek War gets like sucked into the War of 1812 story. Can you talk about Mississippi militia and their role in the War of 1812? And then going towards the Battle of New Orleans, all these kind of weird stories.
Well,
We have a great book you can
We
read
got a
on
great
that.
book on that. Real quick synopsis that Clay can add to it is they're the first on the ground when the first conflict breaks out with the Creeks. And they're at Battle of Burnt Corn Creek, which is the first attack. They are fighting at Fort Mims. They're the first patrols that are sent out in the wake of that. As this ultimately, you've got these 3 campaigns they're supposed to work together. Theirs never gets coordinated with Tennessee and Georgia, so they're operating in basically southwest Alabama for a limited period of time. And then, of course, during the Battle of New Orleans, there's a contingent that makes its way over there and is part of this diverse assemblage of forces that Andrew Jackson cobbles together.
Thomas Hines has a little cavalry brigade there that's kind of well known of some of the elite Natchezians who formed that little battalion. So.
A lot are sent to Fort Stoddard on the Mobile River when the Creek War breaks out, and from there go to other places.
And we talk about the Creek War, and I know it's all happening in Alabama, but the panic back over here was pretty intense. There was a big fear that the Choctaws and the Chickasaws would kind of join in that, and so people as far away as Cotton Gin Port and places like that were geared up for possible battle and war.
They actually talked about what they called the Mississippi Panic, and the Governor Holmes actually talked about how every day he couldn't do his job because so many people were scared there was going to be a Native American attack any day at Natchez. And so it was, we talk about the war where the battles were fought, but it's a region-wide concern, yeah.
Could you comment on, this may be a national political question or maybe it was local, why the Mississippi Territory did not come in as a single state, and also why Mississippi came first and it was Alabama with the larger population was only 2 years later?
I've done whole presentations on that. Real quick synopsis. The Mississippi portion of the territory, what became Mississippi, grew a lot faster. It's where Natchez was. Everything was settled there. Everything else outside, about 5 miles outside Natchez, was the eastern portion of the territory for a long time. And there was an assumption that it would eventually become a state, and the whole place would be run by Natchez. And after the Creek War, you get hundreds of thousands of settlers are settling in the eastern portion of the territory, which became Alabama, and everybody said, well, wait, we don't necessarily think that that's a good idea. Why don't we just divide it? We can have our own control. And so when they had been working towards trying to establish the Mississippi Territory as a state before the War of 1812, and they never could get agreement because they looked on the map and they said in Congress, you know, this state would be one of the biggest, if not the biggest, in the entire country. So we're not ready to do that. They proposed methods for division. One had an east-west line running basically through Jackson, all the way where you'd be north and south. One that proposed being divided into 4 states. Ultimately, some political considerations that had a lot to do with the fact that you could get 4 U.S. senators out of 2 states rather than just 2 out of 1 state was probably one of the things that pushed it over the line to ultimately make them do what they did. But there was not agreement on the ground. People in the eastern and the western section of the territory did not like the border. Both wanted the entire Tombigbee River and Mobile to be in their state. And even after Mississippi, which had historically been the more developed portion, it's where Natchez was, so they were allowed to go into statehood first. Even after they had initiated that process, in order for it to become a state, they had to get a constitution approved. The first days of that debate, there were people that stood up and said, I think we ought to cease and desist the entire thing until we get the border we want, which was the Tombigbee River. So it was not something that people on the ground endorsed as much as officials in D.C.
We have copies of this excellent book for sale over here. We're so proud of this excellent book that we have a sheet cake over here from Campbell's. It's delicious, and it's decorated with the copy of the jacket. I have done my part. I can't do any more. Please, y'all, eat the rest of that cake. I hope that we see you back here Sunday for the program on the Game of Change. I hope that you come back next week for Mike O'Brien. For now, help me thank Mike Bunn and Clay Williams for this program today.